So we'll move on to our program. We want to recognize our series speakers for their support and partnership during these sessions, covering a range of topics for the current advanced energy landscape, particularly Constellation, one of our voltage sponsors, the Nuclear Powers Maryland Coalition, Siemens, and our series sponsor, Cone Resnick. Happy to have everyone in the room. So now it's my pleasure to welcome our special guests for today's program. Full bios of all of our speakers can be viewed online at the www.mdcleanenergy.org/speaker series web link. I'm going to introduce our moderator and very honored to do so. Jason Stanek is the chairman of the Maryland Public Service Commission. He'll be our moderator today. He was appointed by Governor Hogan for a 5-year term beginning in July of 2018. He most recently served as senior counsel to the Energy Subcommittee to the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, where he advised on matters involving national energy policy with specific focus on electricity issues and the operation of regional power markets. Before that, he served in senior positions at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I think he's well qualified to be our moderator today. He earned his law degree from State University of New York at Buffalo and a bachelor's degree from Tulane. He also completed studies at American University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He practices law in New York and he lives in Riverdale, Maryland. He's an avid biker and owner of an electric vehicle. Chairman Stanek, thanks for taking us on today.
Kathy, thank you very much. It's an honor to serve as your moderator as we kick off the 2021 MCEC Speakers Series. And I'm very happy to have such a distinguished panel with me this morning. Obviously, the grid is transforming dramatically, both at the wholesale level and at the distribution level, which serves most of our customers here in the state of Maryland. And we're seeing change happen so dramatically that it's hard to keep track of. In fact, at 3 a.m. this morning, members of the House not Economic Matters, but the House Energy and Commerce Committee was conducting their markup of the new Clean Electricity Performance Program, which is legislation that is price tagged to be about $150 billion and would dramatically change the country's trajectory to get clean energy by 2030. Among some of the provisions, there's $3.2 billion earmarked for resiliency, $8 billion to construct new long-distance electric transmission lines, $3 billion for electric charging equipment, and on and on. So it's a commitment that we see to a greener environment, a cleaner energy system, and this is going to help the state of Maryland accomplish its very aggressive goals to get to clean energy over the next decade. I'm happy that we have a number of experts, 4 experts in the area. I'll introduce each of them separately and then allow them to give some opening remarks before we dive into some discussion. The first is Delegate Laura Charcution, represents District 20 in the state legislature. Proud resident of Tacoma Park, Maryland. She received her PhD in economics at Johns Hopkins University. She pays very close attention to all things environmental justice, clean energy policies, criminal justice reform, and many other issues. She sits on the powerful Economic Matters Committee in the General Assembly in Annapolis. And I know she has very detailed thoughts on not only the matters that come before the Public Service Commission, which is charged with regulating our distribution utilities, but a number of other ideas to get Maryland to its clean energy goals in short order. So let me open it up to Delegate Charcution to give some opening remarks. I'll go through the other panelists as well, and then we'll have a facilitated discussion. Good morning, Delegate.
Thank you, Chairman Stanek. Oh, I have ideas. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. It's an honor to have this opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to all of the nuanced and detailed and policy creative possibilities that we're going to talk about today. But I always do really feel the need to sort of pull us back to where we are and what we're doing, because I do find that sometimes we get so caught up in the nuances and the details of how a particular smart inverter could work or not, and what the rate recovery will be on that, that we forget that what we have in front of us is the very future of humanity, the planet, and the possibility of extinction. And so I just think it's really important to put this conversation in that context, to look at the reality of the recent IPCC report, to look at the reality of the devastation around the world, recent devastation in our own country, hurricanes and flooding, and just not far from my house, in addition to in New York, but not far from my house in Rockville, where we lost a fellow community member to flooding in their basement. And then many people, of course, ended up homeless. And so there is no question that we have got to get this right, and we have got to put everything we have into it. And we can't make any excuses. I feel like sometimes in these conversations, it's too easy to kind of get caught in where things are difficult and allow for delays and excuses. And there's just no space for that anymore. It is our moral obligation to find the way forward. So having said that, I think looking at the grid itself, and I'm really excited about in particular where the Public Service Commission is looking at the distribution grid, because we need to essentially leave it all on the field, because we need all hands on deck, because we need to look at every aspect of our economy. That means we're looking at the grid itself. We're looking at not only what is generation putting into the grid, but how the grid itself is functioning, and really looking at that as an opportunity to address the climate disaster that we're facing. And so we have this chance to really look at how do we build a grid, both the distribution grid, which I think we're a little more focused on today, but also in the transmission grid. And even I think we're going to talk a little bit about transforming the gas grid from gas, which cannot be part of our future, to an electric grid, and possibly I'm really excited to hear about a geothermal grid in the spaces that we currently use fracked fossil natural gas. And so we have this great opportunity to look at decarbonization, what the grid can do for decarbonization. I'm excited to talk about all the specifics around DERs and EVs and maximizing the possibilities for them. But I just want to say one other thing in terms of our big picture. Because we have this opportunity, because we absolutely have to transform just about everything in our economy, from the grid to our generation, to our how we do agriculture, to how we do transportation. Because we're transforming so much right now, it's also an opportunity to get a bunch of things right that we haven't had right in the past. And so putting equity front and center, and addressing historical racism and historical willingness to have certain communities as sacrifice zones where we burned fossil fuels and had catastrophic consequences. It's our chance to turn that on its head and build an equitable future. It's also our chance to make sure that labor is front and center, and that we're building a future where people can reach the middle class, that we have a solid middle class because we have labor standards, because we have strong unions in all of our industries that make sure that people are receiving family sustaining wages. And I think that these conversations we're having have a lot of really incredible opportunity for a transformation, and to keep both of those values front and center in all of it. And I'm looking forward to the rest of this conversation. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Delegate. And you emphasized the theme of transformation that we're seeing up close and personal. Right now, compared to any type of generating resource, it's actually solar is ahead in terms of development of new electricity generating resources, well surpassing coal, well surpassing natural gas. So the future is on our doorstep. We'll next turn to somebody who's working on many of these transformative grid modernization efforts, including energy efficiency, demand response, distributed energy resources, microgrids, energy storage, and electrification of the grid. That is Miss Molly Knoll. Molly is a graduate of the University of Maryland Law School. She's been working for the Public Service Commission for the better part of 5 years on our grid modernization efforts. which we affectionately know here as PC 44. That is our grid modernization docket number. I'll turn it over to Ms. Knoll. Good morning, Molly.
Good morning. As the chairman said, at the risk of correcting my boss, I've been with the PSC for 3 years, but I was with the Maryland Office of People's Counsel for 5 years before that. So I bring the ratepayer advocate perspective to everything we do here. And I did work on the PC 44 dockets prior to joining the commission. The grid of the future, I focus primarily on distribution system issues with the commission. I've worked on our multi-year rate plans, performance incentive metrics, the TOU dockets, our reliability dockets. Delegate Charcution is absolutely correct that addressing climate change is a matter of survival. The flip side of that, though, is keeping the distribution system on is also a matter of survival. I think one thing we've all realized through COVID is that we can do so much more than we ever thought we could, but the distribution system is what keeps all of that up and running. None of us could have worked from home. None of us could have kept our agencies running and our organizations doing the important work that they do without the distribution grid. People's Counsel Paula Carmody, who I first worked with, she said, literally what we do day to day at the commission, keeping the utilities, keeping the lights on, is a matter of the fabric of society. Things would unravel very quickly if we didn't. And having a part in fixing climate change is going to be absolutely essential, but we never lose sight of safe, reliable, affordable service. And that's the flip side, is we can absolutely do almost anything that we need to in terms of equity and in terms of climate change and in terms of good jobs and unions. And we can do it and keep the lights on, but there will be trade-offs on ratepayer impact. There will be trade-offs on what we ask customers to do in engaging with their energy usage. And when I think about the grid of the future, I always think about what are we going to be asking the ratepayer to do. We've explored TOU rates here in Maryland, and that asks people to pay attention to their electricity in a way they've never done before. We put solar on people's houses and we start talking about them as prosumers. We have EVs being deployed, and customers right now, they plug their EV in when they get home and that's the end of it. But if we want to do all of these things with the distribution grid and do all of these things in a reasonable expense, we're going to have to ask people to engage significantly more with their energy usage and their grid than they have in the past. And I think we're in a unique moment where technology can actually pick up a lot of that work for us. From the example of an EV, if you can plug it in and then the grid just tells it when to charge, when load starts dropping, and then it picks it up and we go from there. A TOU rate where I say to my thermostat, I'd like to spend $150 a month on heating, make it so. So when I think about the grid of the future, I think both about what we're going to be asking of the consumer in terms of engagement with the grid, but also what we can ask of technology to step up and take some of those burdens off of the consumer. So that's kind of where I think about things, because I completely trust that PJM and the utilities and everybody will keep the lights on and make it all work on their side of it, but we're gonna need a lot from the public in this process. And that's where I think we're gonna need a lot more interesting and creative solutions, because those are the areas that are outside of the control of all the very educated, committed people that are on this call, so.
Thank you, Molly. As you noted, technology is going to play a core component in effectuating this transition to a cleaner energy economy. If we make it difficult, if we make it as difficult to set the clock on a VCR as it is to have your electric vehicle smart charge without you having to program dates and times, and it could just communicate directly with your local utility, that makes life easier for the customer or the prosumer, as you just mentioned. And it'll allow us to better optimize and make the most out of our limited and ever-aging distribution system of wires. Next, we'll hear from a little different perspective. We'll hear a little bit more about the natural gas industry, hydrogen, and geothermal resources. We have Owen Brady Trachik who is the manager of the Future of Heat non-pipeline and non-pipeline alternatives at National Grid up in Massachusetts. Notwithstanding that he's not a Marylander, he's going to bring an interesting perspective to this transformation here. So good morning, Owen.
Good morning, Chairman Stanek. And I love the comments that have been made by both Delegate Charcution and Ms. Knoll, really framing the challenge that we have in front of us. We do need a cleaner system of delivering energy. We do need to continue to meet our customers' needs, and we need to do that in a way that is increasingly sustainable and will allow for the society that we have built to continue long after any of us are around and are concerned about it. We want to make sure we have a society that is working well for us and for generations that come after us. And so that's why it's so critical that we invest in all of these things. And one of the elements that I'm going to hopefully talk about on our session today is really this non-pipeline alternative framework. Folks may be familiar with non-wires alternatives, but non-pipeline alternatives is a bit less known in sort of the energy space because it's a relatively new concept, but it hits at both the points that the previous speakers have made, not only looking at alternative ways to satisfy customer needs and hopefully to integrate increasingly decarbonized solutions, but also how to be sensitive of the cost impacts to ratepayers. A non-pipeline alternative by definition is a solution that costs less than the capital that was planned to be spent on the gas distribution system. And so therefore, if we could install a geothermal system in lieu of extending the natural gas system, and it was lower cost, meaning that the rates for ratepayers would be lower, and the needs are still met, and it has decarbonization benefits, that's really a wonderful solution. So National Grid is committed to exploring all of these things and more, as you mentioned in your initial comments. Hydrogen, renewable natural gas, geothermal, we're looking at all of it, but we are looking at all of it within the framework of achieving net zero, supporting our customers and our communities, and ensuring that we are playing an active part in helping us go through the energy transition and reducing the disruption to our customers as we do so.
Thank you, Owen. As you're well aware, in this business, we reward our utilities for spending more money. And that's effectively the concept of rate base. However, this transition poses an opportunity, perhaps, as you just stated, that we reward our utilities for providing value, as opposed to earning a rate of return on as much money that they could effectively put into their rate base. So we'll touch more on that over the next 90 minutes. The last speaker of our panel is an expert in transmission planning. We have Ken Seiler, who's the VP for transmission planning at PJM. For those of you who don't know, PJM is the world's largest organized wholesale electricity market based out of Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Ken's been in this business for quite a while, and he will be providing his unique perspective from the grid operator regarding some of the transformation that is currently occurring. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Chairman Stanek, and good morning to everybody out there. If we could go to the next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit about the grid of the future and where we see it as it is today and where we think it is going tomorrow. So if you look at the slide I have here in front of you, we really believe in part the grid of the future is here. We're seeing a number of changes as we talked about the transformation within the grid, both at the distribution, generation, and load levels, and as well as transmission. For example, we're seeing 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind being planned in the state of New Jersey. We're also seeing wind planned off the state of Maryland, as well as the state of Virginia and North Carolina. And all that needs to be integrated. And it's very exciting for us, frankly, because it provides another generation source to our east, where we have no generation, no tie lines, and it makes our system much more reliable, much more resilient at the end of the day. Beyond storage, we're also seeing storage proposed as a transmission asset at times to replace, expensive upgrades. We're seeing storage being proposed to supplement those upgrades. We're seeing DER at rooftop levels on solar, commercial levels. We're seeing electric vehicles who are both drawing electricity from the grid as well as injecting electricity back into the grid. We also have some areas in our system where we have a microgrid type environment, which is really an offline type grid that then is integrated at times when it's needed, as well as the DER integration with Order 2222, where we see the aggregation of many types of distributed generation, all at the same time while we're considering things like extreme weather, cybersecurity events. All those things need to be taken into account as they are today, while at the same time, much like many areas where we have bridges and roads and that sort of thing, water systems, sewer systems that's aging, we also have an aging grid. The bulk of our bulk transmission system was built back in the 1960s and parts in the early 1970s. Those facilities are aging, and we need to figure out ways to really optimize all of this. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the future and where we see us going as part of the future here. And I'll just conclude with a couple of comments. For us, really, the grid of the future is a forecasted vision for the future power grid that takes into account the changing trends in both generation, transmission, distribution, and load. And what we need to do is part of integrating all that to decarbonize the system. Many trends are occurring. We're tracking many trends. For example, within our generation interconnection queue, 93% of our projects are renewables, meaning wind, solar, and batteries across the entire footprint. And that in and of itself is telling. We're also seeing a lot of interest in a lot of other areas as well. And we need to continue to monitor these trends and look for ways that we can help implement and effectuate and execute on the policies that we have from both our states as well as our federal government going forward. So a lot of changes as we see moving forward, but we're going to have to answer a number of questions around what is the impact as a result of the generation shift to the grid? How will storage facilities and their intermittency be integrated into grid and the operational flexibility to maintain reliability? How will electric vehicles drive load growth? And what are the implications for the grid of the future as we look at things like DER? And then in addition, a hot topic at the FERC most recently with a tech conference as late as last Friday is grid enhancing technologies. How do we optimize the grid, applying grid enhancing technologies? Because the amount of transmission that we can build in the future in terms of greenfield is going to be very, very limited. It's very expensive to site transmission lines. So why don't we optimize the grid corridors that we have today, optimize the technologies, the software, the data, so that we can build out an efficient and cost-effective grid in our futures. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks, Chairman Stanek. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. The number that you just threw out is stark. 93% of what's in your generation queue now is intermittent renewables. Obviously, operating that type of a grid versus baseload units such as coal and gas resources is going to be dramatically different and pose a challenge for the RTO going forward, all 6 of our RTOs in the country. Maryland is a state where we currently have 5 coal units remaining, of which 4 of them have announced an intent to retire and exit the market. So the share of the portfolio for Maryland is going to be dramatically changing as well. We have the status where we're one of few states where we are a net energy importer. So not only are we not producing within our state borders enough electricity to supply the needs of Marylanders, but we have to contract out and import much of that electricity. As we begin the facilitated discussion, I would invite audience members to use the Q&A box to include any questions. So you could put that in the box. Additionally, we'll reserve a few minutes at the very end to have some discussions. But Ken, before I go to Delegate Charcution, I do have a question. You mentioned Order 2222 that came out of FERC last September. Can you elaborate as to what that order said and why it's so significant for distributed energy resources?
Yes, indeed. So Order 2222 was an order that took into account the ability to aggregate distribution resources that are much more distributed throughout the footprint. And what it did was it allowed the electric distribution companies within our footprint to take and aggregate those facilities and then roll those into potentially the wholesale market, such that those providers could earn money within our marketplace, those facilities could be integrated. We could account for those within our models. We could identify what the transmission impacts are going to be in a way that we could leverage some of the state policies that are out there to really take advantage and leverage the benefits of having rooftop solar, those types of things on the grid, and then integrate those into our ops and market systems and all our models so that we can maintain a reliable grid. The most important thing here, I think, to keep in mind is the closer you can get generation to the load centers is always going to be much more reliable than having to build transmission, so that transmission does not have to be built. So if you can locate generation closer to the load centers, it's much more reliable, much more resilient. You're not as subject to some of the extreme weather events like we see with some of the storms that we're seeing. So it's a very important order for us to leverage and take into account all the benefits of a distributed energy resource across our entire footprint, and then integrate those into the market and make those profitable for all of those who want to participate.
Thanks, Ken. I understand that resources as small as 1 kilowatt can actually participate if they aggregate with some larger resources. So that is definitely a game changer. Delegate Charcution has had a demonstrated interest both in microgrids and geothermal production. She introduced some very successful legislation earlier this year. Delegate, what more in terms of state policies do we need here in Maryland to further either push or nudge along this transition?
Yes, well, thank you for the question. I think it's I'll give just a couple of high level answers to that, because I do think there are a number of things that we need to do at the state level. First, I just want to mention thanks to Ken for being here and for those slides and for your comments about distributed energy. And I know, one of the issues at the PJM level that's been a real challenge has been really finding a way to make sure that the state policies are honored and respected and supported and integrated into how PJM is operating. And we spent the last few years wrestling on the issue of the MOPR, which I have to say publicly now I'm thrilled with the current PJM filing. Thank you for that. And look forward to really shifting how we work together, and really hope that we all continue to work together with the state policies that are prioritizing decarbonization as a key piece of, and as a benefit to what PJM is doing in terms of reliability in the broader grid. So that's a really exciting shift since I think the last time we were all here talking about the issue. And I feel cautiously optimistic, although I will say that I think it's also is tied to this bigger question of how do we find a way to make sure that we develop the state policies that are needed to make the shift, but that also those state policies are integrated into the transmission and the broader generation and the decision making that's done sort of with PJM and then from FERC. And again, because of the changes at the federal level, I think we're in a stronger position now to do that. And the hope is that we kind of continue on that trajectory. And I think that the point that Ken's made about FERC Order 2222 is really important. I think some other really important pieces are questions about how storage will be compensated. I think there's a lot of places where states are making policies to prioritize and ultimately to subsidize both DERs as well as clean energy generation in the transmission grid, and geothermal and others. And those same policies end up being undermined. So for example, if we're going to bring more storage onto the grid, which we all know that we have to do, and we have to do it as soon as possible, because the sooner we start moving on storage, the cheaper it will become. So there's the chicken and egg piece of like, we think it's going to get cheaper at some point, and we're sort of waiting for it to get cheaper, and then we'll really deploy it. But I think one of the things that we know is that unless we can get sort of maximize all of the revenue sort of stacks to storage, we're not going to get it on the grid as quickly as we need to. And so this is, again, an example of where there's sort of this PJM value of storage in the capacity market, and then also how states want to value storage and subsidize storage and move it along in their RPS or whatever it might be. So I think there's a lot of really important interplay. So I'm thrilled that PJM is here with us today, and I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation. In terms of other really sort of big picture conversations I think that we need to have at the state level, I do think that there's this opportunity now, and I think I've shared that with you and others, to really look at how do we integrate the state policy into the distribution planning process that Public Service Commission is beginning to embark on. And because there are these questions about really how do we, for example, what do we think of as the role of microgrids in our resiliency and our emergency management planning, right? What are the roles of microgrids going to be? We've looked at microgrids a lot as a part of our sort of in terms of critical infrastructure, hospitals, public safety, but how do we also create them as sources of safety and resiliency in low-income communities that always are more harmed by the natural disasters that hit us? And then can we, on top of that, not just have it as a resiliency resource, but also build on that so that that very same microgrid on blue sky days is a way to create ownership in a low-income community of more DERs, right? And then that ties back, of course, to the 2222 and all of these other pieces about how do you facilitate ownership and equitable ownership of DERs? How do we really make that something that's available to everybody? I think that I want to talk a little bit about beneficial electrification. I think we have to make some really important decisions in the next few years, because there is this question about how much more do we continue to invest in. Well, there's two pieces. One is I think we're at a very dangerous place with gas companies continue to expand a fossil gas infrastructure, pointing to sort of a false possibility of renewable natural gas as what's going to flow through those, when the reality is that all of the studies show maybe about 10% of our current natural gas usage could be renewable natural gas in maybe 10 or 15 years. And so what that tells us is we need to start now with policies that say, first of all, no new fossil fuel infrastructure, no new natural gas pipelines. Second of all, how do we target renewable natural gas to the hardest to electrify sources? And third of all, how do we electrify everything else? And I do think that geothermal air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps are two of the really key pieces of what will allow us to electrify everything else. And I think that this is where we need to start getting creative. And this is why I had encouraged that we have Owen join us today, because I think the work that's being done in Massachusetts is very creative, looking at how do you, without having to dismantle our gas utilities, how do we take advantage of the utilities and the workers and the rights of way that they have, but still move away completely from fracked or even renewable gas, because that's even the two of them together, that can't be part of our future. So I think, when I put the geothermal bill in this year, it was really to grow the industry in the state. But my hope is that we really move beyond just sort of house by house or school by school, and really start thinking more in terms of microgrids that maximize both the efficiency of the systems, but also maximize the possibilities of broad deployment of those systems.
That was a lot packed in there, Delegate. It's clear why you were one of the most accomplished freshman legislators in the Assembly. Number one is the recognition that we as Maryland cannot go it alone. We're just one of 13 states in PJM, so we do need to have a coordinated approach. The second point that you made was, well, you made many points, but one other point was the cost of the system up front. Obviously, battery storage technology is very expensive. We saw just yesterday the country's largest storage project, Moss Landing, had an event with a fire. So the technology is being worked on. It's not quite perfect just yet, but it's getting there. But how much should ratepayers be expected to bear in terms of the cost? And we actually have a poll question. If Sabrina could bring up the poll question, we will ask our audience effectively, how much would you as a residential ratepayer be willing to pay? So there's that question. If you could just take a moment and answer. Okay, I know it was up on the screen relatively quickly, but we have a nice distribution. Folks willing to pay up to $5 a month or more than 15 a month. So there's no clear decisive answer here. Just 6% don't want to pay any more for these grid enhancements. Thank you, Sabrina. Let me turn to Owen for a question now. And if we could take down the slides, thank you. Owen, you're familiar with Con Edison and their smart solutions and some of the measures that have been taken there in your service territory. Can you give us any thoughts regarding the application of some of these solutions in Maryland?
So the solutions that have been coming out of these solicitations that have been put to the market tend to fall into a couple of categories. There are sort of well-known, I'll call them capacity projects, which tend to be more on the supply side. So these are things like trucked or permanent CNG or LNG facilities, right? Effectively increasing the available gas supply in a region. But then you see a lot more on the demand side as well. And these tend to be predominantly electrification, because if you are trying to address the needs of customers and natural gas is not an option for those customers, one of the things that's been most aggressively pursued and deployed has been electrification. We don't see quite as many installation of things like propane boilers or oil boilers in our regions as we might have in the past. And with the increase in the efficiency and performance of electrification technology, it can be a pretty good fit for consumers. So when Con Ed has done those solicitations, and when we in National Grid have looked at this, we've really seen that there is an interest and an opportunity in some of these electrification technologies, which is why we're so excited about the geothermal potential within our region as we start to think about how do we meet customer needs going forward. So that's really what we've been looking at. And the reason that I'm such an advocate for geothermal in particular, or ground source heat pumps to be slightly more technical, is simply because if we are envisioning a future in which everybody or a large percentage of energy uses are met through electrification, we want to ensure that that electrification is done in a way that is efficient and ideally as efficient as possible. We are making effectively kind of a once in a century investment in our infrastructure over the course of the next 3 decades. And we want to ensure that we are preparing ourselves for a future, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that is as sustainable as possible. And if we can reduce the total amount of input energy that is required to meet the needs, then that's going to make it easier to decarbonize that input energy, because simply less of it will be needed. So if we put in ground source heat pumps, they will not only be able to meet customers' needs on both the hottest and the coldest days, but they will reduce the impact on the electric grid, which on an individual customer level is perhaps not critical, but as we start to think about large swaths of the population and of the country potentially adopting electrification, and as we start to think about additional end uses that may require the electric grid, such as electric vehicles, we really need to be sensitive to those aggregate impacts to the grid so that Ken is able to sleep at night as we think about how we plan for the infrastructure going forward. So if we can take the approach and some of the skills, as was mentioned, of an entity like a gas utility, which is used to installing and owning and operating pipe assets under the ground, use those to provide a resource to consumers that increases the efficiency of their system, reduces total billed energy usage, and also reduces peak day impacts. That seems like a pretty good outcome and something that we may be able to do, Chairman Stanek, to your point about sort of existing rate structures and existing rate case approaches that have been used by utilities that may allow us to circumvent that chicken and the egg concern about developers and projects going forward without intervention. And as we think about, again, the time that we have remaining to us, 29, almost 28 years until that sort of 2050 line in the sand, you know, we really need to start moving very quickly on this. And so moving past the choices that individual consumers are making to adopt a geothermal system, and instead starting to think about how do we work at both the sort of block, neighborhood, community, and then eventually even region level. I think it's going to be so important for us to be innovative in terms of how we support these technologies, both in the regions that we're looking at as well as in Maryland.
Well, as you know, ground source heat pumps are old school technology that's having a second look right now. The state of Maryland looked towards Massachusetts and some of the economic incentives that are provided to your residents. Obviously, with new build construction, it makes a lot more sense. As the delegate knows, once you have the house built and trying to retrofit, it involves a little more invasive procedures and expense. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. They go to different sources if you do have questions. We do have a question for Molly Knoll. And Molly, what are some of the specific recommendations that are now coming out of the PC 44 grid modernization efforts? Obviously, it's been a multi-year process. What are some of the fruit that it's beginning to bear?
Sure. So the PC 44 process had 5 initial work groups. In order of productivity, the TOU work group produced a pilot, which is, it concluded its pilot period earlier this year. We'll be receiving final results of that in the next month or two. Preliminary results were very, very interesting. They actually found an efficiency gain in our TOU pilot, which turns out to be very anomalous compared to other TOU pilots in the past. I'm interested to see if that continued into the COVID period. Our EV work group has launched our EV pilot, which is about charging chargers, both utility owned and subsidies for customers putting smart chargers into their homes. A lot of the EV pilot was organized around figuring out what is actually happening. What does charging behavior actually look like? Charging behavior is not probably going to be a problem for the grid in the next couple of years, but if we can learn now what it's really going to look like when there's much broader adoption, that'll help us get ahead of any grid impacts that it might have. The storage program has also launched a pilot. We now have storage either set to deploy or already deployed in all of the major utility service territories in Maryland. And we're going to see how those integrate. They'll be providing both distribution services as well as bulk power services at the PJM level. So they'll be allowed to interact in the frequency market and do some energy arbitrage. Our interconnection work group has launched several rulemakings, which have modified how our utilities are doing interconnections for DERs. Most recent rulemaking was put off. Well, we have a request to put it off because of some delay in implementing the new standards that we're relying on. But we've had several successful rulemakings out of the interconnection group. The next heavy item they're going to plan on working on is potentially how we do cost allocation for grid upgrades, which will be a big issue when you have one home that needs to have a significant distribution system upgrade. How do you allocate the costs of getting that next solar panel into the system, which then means you can have another 1,000 solar panels on the system. We've also had our CMCC, Competitive Markets and Customer Choice Work Group. That's been focused for several years actually on how we extract customer usage data from the utility on an ongoing basis. We don't know quite yet what the market's going to be for customer data, but it potentially could have active energy management. It potentially could help solar developers deploy their marketing more effectively. It could help universities do research into what individual load profiles look like. Getting that data out of the utilities and into the public with the customer's permission, obviously, could be a huge building block in unlocking a lot of what we're looking for on the customer side and the distribution side moving forward. And then the last work group, which we've recently launched, is our distribution system planning work group. We really want to kind of get under the hood and see what the utilities are doing when they're planning their system. And we don't know yet how that's going to play out or what the deliverables might be from that process. For now, we're doing a series of educational sessions about how the utilities currently plan. We'll probably do one on DER integration. It is a big issue. We'll probably also have another one for various stakeholders to kind of speak through their wishes and dreams for the distribution system planning process. So we have a little idea of where everybody's coming from. The utilities probably think they're doing exactly what they should be doing and are happy. And we'd like to know what other folks think they should be seeing. So we have a lot coming out of PC 44, and kind of all of those are building blocks to grid modernization. They're putting us in a position to have the information we need, to have the infrastructure we need, to have the visibility into the utility processes that we need, to have the cost recovery mechanisms that we need, so that we can make the grid responsive to all of the things it's going to need to be responsive to in the future, from, customer engagement to, transportation electrification to two-way power flows, all of the things that the grid's going to need to be able to absorb moving forward. And hopefully it'll also put us in a place where we can plan ahead for all of those types of problems, not problems, opportunities. Just as an example, I think about EV charging, a cluster of EV chargers. The first one, it's absolutely worth it for the utility to upgrade their system. And the second cluster, again, let's just upgrade in that local area. But by the 50th cluster or broad adoption of EVs, we should have done a managed charging program from day one. Each of those upgrades turns out to become a stranded cost. So we're really trying to put the pieces in place to figure out what are the problems we're going to have to solve, and then what are the solutions that we can do ahead of time so that we don't just solve this with more expensive infrastructure in the ground.
Thanks, Molly. As a first adopter, Maryland is learning by doing at this point, particularly with electric vehicles. We have a goal of getting 300,000 registered and on the road by 2025. But as a leader, similar to California and Massachusetts, we're learning by some mistakes. We're making mid-course corrections as we roll out these EV-related charging programs. This is a question for both Ken and the delegate from Alberto Zagata. And he asks, where does nuclear fit in Maryland's energy plans? Perhaps we'll start with Ken first. Obviously, our Calvert Cliff resource is pretty substantial in fulfilling the needs of Maryland's electric demands.
Yeah, I think for us, that type of power is really once considered a baseload power. And really what it does is it's a very steady, clean energy that allows us to have a significant amount of inertia, short circuit, any number of electrical parameters and characteristics that are very important for us to run the grid, and certainly a key component for us going forward. Where we do not have that type of power, we certainly accommodate it with other areas, or we import power into those areas. But for example, in the state of Maryland, Calvert Cliffs is very important, especially in light of the potential for or pending deactivation of the coal units in the state as well, since Maryland does import a lot of their power. So Calvert Cliffs would be a nice steady state unit to have continue to run and keep the power flowing within the state of Maryland as it fits in with all the other types of generation that we're looking to integrate into our system.
Thank you. Now, as a large baseload unit, I expect it to be a valuable resource for your control room operators. Delegate Charcution, do you concur?
Yeah, for the most part, I do. So I think that this conversation about nuclear, there's a lot of pieces to it. And I actually am going to visit the Calvert Cliffs plants next week. So I'm looking forward to that and learning more. I think that the reality is that right now where we are in this transition and in the urgency of getting to net zero, there's no question that nuclear is a piece of this transition for the foreseeable future. I think that the challenge becomes that nuclear still really does have a lot of problems, specifically waste and mining. And I think that it would be dangerous to consider it part of our very long-term future. And so when we And so I think for the foreseeable future, it will be a key piece. I think for our sort of medium longer term future, we really need to look at all of the sort of problems with it and risks with it, in addition to all of the other possibilities and things that sort of aren't even in our conversation, like the possibilities of virtual power plants with people's hot water heaters, right? Which we haven't even started talking about yet. So I think there's so many places that we could go. And so the reason that I mention that is I think where the conversation about nuclear often ends up from a policy perspective is, are we going to subsidize it? Does it deserve the same subsidies as, for example, emerging technologies like offshore wind and storage and solar? And so I think that's where the conversation becomes a little more difficult, because while it's a key piece of our transition, and I wouldn't be advocating for shutting it down anytime soon, I do think that we need to really look at if subsidies are on the table. I think we need to look at what those costs are, what they would support nuclear to do, and what could we do if we took that same money and put it into other sources. And so I think too often that last piece of the analysis doesn't get done. So if we were to look at that at the state level, those would be the questions I'd be asking before I would be willing to sort of consider if there ought to be subsidies that go in that direction. If I could, Chairman, can I come back? You had asked a question about cost earlier. Can I answer that question as well? Or
Yes, feel free to answer that question as well, but I did receive a question from Alfred Bartlett, and he says, when we talk about ratepayer costs, we don't really define it. So how do we evaluate and calculate cost in this new and rapidly changing environment?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. That actually ties into, I think, what I was going to say, which is there was another question that looks like it was on the screen, but it didn't make it into the survey question. I think there is this dangerous sort of two-sided thinking that we get caught into, which is generally ratepayers pay for electricity and upgrades, transmission, distribution, energy investments. And so if we're going to sort of fix the problem, what do ratepayers have to take on? And I think we need to really think much more broadly about it. I think we need to ask ourselves, what are the costs of not moving forward, right? Like, what is the cost? Like, how much would we be willing to pay to not have the human race go extinct in 100 years? And I know that sounds melodramatic, but I think that is a reality. That's not just a Maryland question. It's a global question, but it is a reality of a question that ought to be in front of us. But what are we willing to pay to not go extinct? But also more directly, like, what are we willing to pay? We are paying, like, there are costs. And this is the problem with sort of the way we do budgeting and the way we consider costs and benefits as policymakers in our very sort of siloed world. Like, what are we paying right now in terms of the flooding? What are we paying right now in terms of the health impacts? What are we paying right now in terms of the heat impacts? What are we paying right now in terms of the agricultural impacts? What are we paying right now in terms of all of those things? And do we want to keep paying the cost there? So like the flip of it also is, how much are you willing to pay in your electricity rates? How much are you willing to pay in rebuilding your basement every year? How much are you willing to pay in emergency asthma costs? How much are you willing to pay or how much are we willing to give up in terms of the East Coast of the United States? How much are we willing to just let go? How much are we willing to pay to have our fruits and vegetables, grown and not with it, and to keep agricultural land on the Eastern Shore? How much, like that's the other piece of the question. And then I think we have to go beyond ratepayers. I think we really have to challenge ourselves and say, are we willing to have fossil fuel industry pay for all of the profits they've made at the expense of our health and our planet? And I think, we went through that with tobacco. We've gone through that recently now with opioids. And I think there's the beginning of going through that with climate. And I think that that's totally appropriate. I think we talk a lot about a carbon tax and a carbon fee, and there's ways to do that that are effective, but there's that's one possibility. But I think that there's also this question about who has been living large off of the damage to the world and to our health. And should they be paying, and I think that they should. I think there's also questions about taxpayer subsidies that have subsidized fossil fuels for, about a century now. Can we grab some of that? So I just think we need to ask the question, not so much of like, what are ratepayers willing to pay? That's a piece of it, but it's a very limited, it's really limiting our imagination if that's where we stop the conversation. And we really have to broaden it out to say, what do we have to do? What are all the ways to do that? What is that going to cost, and where should that money come from? And I think that's the order that we need to do this in, and we need to do all of it as quickly as possible. But we've got to get out of the trap of thinking only about ratepayers and what can they afford, because I think if we're thinking that way, we're not going to get this done in time.
Well, it goes back to the questions of can we afford to do it, or can we afford not to do it? I know Molly Knoll wants to jump in, but before she does, we reversed the orders of some of the poll questions earlier, and you may have seen the questions fly through the screen. So we want to bring up that first question again, give everybody time to read it and answer. So if Sabrina, we could bring up poll question number 1. There we go. Which of the following are appropriate funding sources for the investments needed? So effectively, who should pay for this? If you could get in your responses, we will pull up the survey results momentarily. Who pays? Okay, so this was multiple choice, so there may be a plurality or a majority in some, but carbon tax followed by federal funds seem to be the clear winners. With ratepayer funds, capacity market, and state funds coming in effectively tied for second. Although interestingly enough, funds from lawsuits against fossil fuel companies, which has been discussed, is receiving about 50% of the vote. All right, thank you for participating. We'll turn to Molly Knoll. Molly, do you want to answer that question on sort of who pays and what is the actual cost?
Yeah, so I want to actually, Delegate Charcutian's job is the big picture, and as a regulator, our job is the much smaller picture of just the ratepayers in the distribution system. And the question, it was talking about grid enhancing technologies and the definition of cost. And Maryland's looking very carefully at cost benefit analyses. We looked at them in storage. We looked at them with the electric vehicle pilots. We're expecting a filing in EVs in the near future. But the best model that I can talk about on this is actually our Empower program, which has been in effect for a fairly long time. And every dollar we spend in Empower gets back $1.40 in benefits. And basically, customers look at their bill and they say, it's an $8 Empower charge, or it's a $10 Empower charge, because 10 will make my math easier. But in reality, you're getting charged $10 in Empower, but you're not getting charged at $14 on your distribution bill. But the customers never see that. It's a counterfactual, right? It's money we never had to spend. It's distribution investments we never had to make. And that's actually going to be a huge portion of how we look at and analyze grid modernization proposals and activities and all of the things that the utility is going to bring to us. And the commission is probably going to have to look at some alternative recovery mechanisms, putting things like managed charging on an equal footing with distribution upgrades, things like performance incentive metrics, where we are trying to align the utilities goals with our state policies through money, because we are primarily an economic regulator. That's our biggest tool in our box to guide the utilities to where the commission and the state legislature wants them to go. So the cost is huge, but I think the premise of the question was, is this really going to cost us money? And Delegate Charcutian's thinking of this, well, can we afford not to do this for 100 years on climate change? But even on the much smaller question of, can we afford to not do this for the grid? The answer may be no, we can't afford to not do this, and we will get more service for less money if we do it properly. And I think Empower showed us that very powerfully for the past decade. And if we can use that same model of looking at not just the distribution system upgrades, but also the health benefits, the avoided investments in transmission, the avoided generation costs. Even we go so far as looking at the impact on the cost of new entry in the capacity markets. When we do the Empower analysis, we really try and put everything in there. And the more we can put in there and value, the better we can give the utility certainty on how they're going to get cost recovery and how the commission's going to value what they're doing. And that's a huge piece that goes across all of the various things we're doing in grid modernization.
Well, we have a theme here of now cost allocation, right? Does beneficiary pays? Does the cost causer pay? Does it get pancake rates or postage stamp across every single ratepayer? We have a question from Cheryl DeBerry, and I'll throw this to Ken. How do you feel about requiring buried electric transmission lines? I feel aerial lines are a vulnerability that is overlooked.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thanks for that. So buried lines certainly have a place within the grid. They may have a place, for example, maybe along our coastal waters where you have higher winds from storms or hurricanes and that kind of thing. But keep in mind the cost for burying transmission lines or even distribution lines is usually 6 to 10 times the rate of going overhead. So it's very expensive, but I think it can be used surgically in certain areas where maybe you have high wind corridors, maybe along areas where you have higher risk due to storms or hurricanes, that type of thing, or historical tornadoes or any number of other factors. So I do believe it has a place just like everything else within the grid. But to do that with everything, I think would be very expensive. And in addition, it takes much, much longer to restore service when you have an issue because of the fact that you have to get backhoes and that types of things to dig up the fault. First, you have to find the fault or find where the equipment failed. Then you got to get backhoes in there. You got to dig the ground up. You got to get crews in there. It's very difficult in many ways to restore service.
And Ken, is it true that you have to actually air condition the vaults in which transmission lines are buried?
Yeah, for the bulk transmission lines, you do. Usually what you have is you have some sort of air conditioning. You have oil pipe-filled cables that you have to circulate and cool through chillers. For the distribution system, you do not. It doesn't carry that kind of heat, that kind of ampacity. But for the bulk transmission lines, yes, you absolutely do. That's very true.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to another question for both Owen and the delegate. This is from Demetra McBride, and she wants to know about where do we see the local governments in terms of charting their own path to carbon neutrality. She noted that in Massachusetts, they were a leader in community choice aggregation, which allows a particular municipality to aggregate the volume and size of its customer base to negotiate better deals with retail energy suppliers. Owen, do you have any thoughts on some of those programs in Massachusetts? And then we'll turn to Delegate Charcution.
So we are very supportive of those types of programs. And one of the things that I always think is just a useful level setting for everybody is to really kind of consider the utility role in all of this. My first boss, when I started in the utility industry, described to me that, in fact, we are, in essence, a trucking company as much as we are an energy company, in that we deliver energy to consumers, but we are not inherently the ones that are producing the energy. And in some cases, in areas where there's deregulation, we may not even be the ones that are procuring the energy on behalf of our customers. And so we try to support our communities working through projects like community choice aggregation and thinking about ways that they can work with their residents and their constituents to ensure that they have access to the information that they need to make informed energy choices. And we are simply trying to respond as best we can to manage the system. And as we talked about at the start of this session, with 93% of the projects coming in the generation queue being intermittent renewables, the comment was made that that is a different type of grid to manage than if it is predominantly sort of either base load or dispatchable power resources. And so similarly, if a community is making significant energy choices, there will be implications for how the grid, either the gas or the electric grid, would be managed at the distribution level. And so we need to be thinking about that. We need to be working with the communities in that way. And in some cases, you may need to have a conversation with the community to say, if you do X, right, Y reaction will be required in order to ensure that there is safe and reliable service at all times. And of course, we would try to work through that to figure out what is the optimal outcome for the community to help them achieve their goals. But we want to make sure that all elements of sort of the cost or value equation to the question that was just coming up are made known to everybody involved in making the decision. And one thing I'll just say before I turn it over to Delegate Charcution is that in the non-pipeline alternative space, we're thinking very carefully about the value proposition because, of course, we're comparing entirely different types of investments, right? Not only from a technological standpoint, but also potentially from an accounting standpoint, as we think about the difference between a long-lived capital asset investment through gas piping, which is, to your point, Chairman Stanek, is something that we've done for a long time, and that there are now significant kind of regulations built up around how that's treated and what that looks like, and potentially shifting over to paying a third party to go in and invest in a system, right, that may now be treated as an operating expense. So instead of having a 50-year depreciation period on the asset, you might have a similar cost asset that is a lower cost as defined by an NPA. But that cost is entirely experienced either in the year in which the project is completed or potentially over a sort of agreed upon depreciation period with the regulatory body. And so we have to be cognizant of the impacts of those sorts of things. And similarly, we want to be looking at all of the possible value streams so that we can be enabling these sorts of projects. And just for folks that are on the session that may not be as sort of deeply in the details of all of this, there are three primary cost tests that are used. So there's a societal cost test, an SCT, a utility cost test, a UCT, and a ratepayer impact measure, or RIM, which are the three primary ones that we use in our region, and there may be additional ones in Maryland that are used as well. And so looking at each of those three can produce very different outcomes for different projects. And it tends to relate to whether or not the sort of externalities and non-energy benefits or non-cost lines are included. And I'll just say that in December of 2020, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation put forth a statement on carbon value, essentially, and put forth a pretty aggressive price for carbon and methane emissions per ton. And so we're starting to think about how do we build that into the valuation of these sorts of projects, and how do we ensure that we are not turning a blind eye to the realities of the costs of the choices that are being made. And going back to that question of working with communities, how do we ensure that everybody has that information and everybody can make informed choices about the energy investments that they may be making? So Delegate Charcution, over to you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, very thoughtful response. And I think just picking up where you left off, and to Molly's point, I mean, there are sort of we give statutory direction to the Public Service Commission, right? And these are the tools you have. And then it's on us really to give statutory direction, right? To consider climate, to give statutory direction to consider equity. It's to give statutory direction to consider long-term costs of methane emissions, right? And so, so I appreciate kind of really that thought process of how are we incorporating all the externalities. And it is that challenge that I was describing earlier of sort of our siloed budgeting in terms of public policy, our siloed budgeting and the siloed sort of cost benefit that ends up getting done. I think the question sort of started with community choice energy, which I will say that I learned a lot from Massachusetts in crafting the legislation that we have here in Maryland, and I'm really excited for Montgomery County to move forward with that. I think that it is, I talked a lot about, I continue to talk about it as this idea of energy democracy. I think it's the epitome of sort of putting the choices in the hands of the people about where and how we want our energy to come from, while not putting the people at risk of predatory practices of retail suppliers, who not all of them are using predatory practices, but many of them are. And so that idea of sort of maximizing the value of a deregulated market, maximizing the value of competition, which is supposed to be about benefiting consumers ultimately. And so it puts the energy democracy being about putting the decisions about energy in a democratic process that allows consumers to make that choice, but do it through an elected government that has the ability then to negotiate on behalf of 1 million people, 20,000 people, however many people might be in it. And so I think, so it's a really exciting model. I'm really excited for us to have that chance. And I think the other thing I would say about it is what we're seeing in Maryland and what we tend to see across the country is often you may get local governments willing to experiment before a state government's willing to experiment. And we absolutely in this country have state governments willing to move forward before the federal government's willing to move forward. And so it is important to have tools out there like community choice energy, like the ability to do natural gas hookup bans, like those kinds of things that would let local governments experiment with those things, because it gives us a chance then to learn, like we saw with plastic bag taxes and then plastic bag bans, right? Before the state's politically ready to move in that direction, we see what it looks like at a local level. And so, and again, then before the federal government moves, we've seen, you know, where states have been successful. And so I think it's there is a very important role for local government and then for this kind of collaboration between local government, state government, PJM, federal government, FERC, and Public Service Commission.
Thank you, Delegate. And we'll look forward to seeing community choice energy and aggregation rolled out in the state over the next coming years for Montgomery County. Ken, we have more of a distribution system question here from Paul Verchinsky, who is an electric vehicle enthusiast, and he sits on a board appointed by Governor Hogan. He noted that over the past 100 years, the grid was only made to go one way, from the generator to service the home or the commercial facility. With vehicle to grid technology beginning to become more popular, is the grid able to handle this sort of a two-way communication as opposed to just a one-way flow, which has been predominantly the method for the history of electric distribution?
Yeah, the answer a little bit is it depends, right? So in many areas where we have very advanced distribution systems, it is. And frankly, if we have a limited number of DERs connecting to the distribution system, the transmission system and the system is certainly capable of moving power both ways, whether it's from transmission to distribution or distribution up into the transmission system. The one example I'll point you to is the one we have today in the state of North Carolina in Dominion's territory. We have such a large concentration of solar resources in that area that oftentimes on bright sunny days, especially in the spring and fall, during our lighter load period, we're seeing a lot of megawatts flowing from the distribution system up onto the transmission system and causing flows to reverse. So in those examples, we are able to accommodate that. It's non-traditional, but the system is usually able to accommodate it. Sometimes there's protection and control system changes that need to take place within the substations, but those are very, very minor changes within our control systems that can accommodate those. So I think the answer is yes. In most of our areas, some of the areas would require very, very minor adjustments.
Thank you, Ken. As we move forward, we have a question for all the panelists here. This one is from Peter Dodson Westphalen. Peter writes, what are the panelists' views on demand flexibility, helping to support renewable resource integration while maintaining reliability on both the transmission and distribution systems? So I take it as that question is whether or not customers, ratepayers, should be allowed to choose some level of flexibility on their service. I suspect that's a controversial topic in some quarters, although by the same token, here in Maryland, we've had a program that allows the customer to set their air conditioning control, effectively turn that over to the utility. So when PJM calls a peak system day, the local utility, you've already given them permission to throttle your air conditioning output. Maybe we'll begin with Molly. Do you have thoughts on demand flexibility?
Sure. So I think demand flexibility should be a huge part of the conversation, but I think the way you unlock the actual potential there is with technology. I think most people aren't going to be willing to just go and change the thermostat. The thermostat has to do it for them. Most people aren't going to be willing to go unplug their EV. The charger has to do it for them. People are not going to cycle their own water heater. It has to do it for them. And I hesitate to say this, but right now, the entity that's best poised to do that is the utility. They have the most visibility into their system, and with the right technologies in place, they could have the most touch points with the customer and the most control over those things. Maryland's a fully restructured market, and I would love the market to be able to provide this service, but we've been at this for 20 years and nobody's doing it yet. And so it becomes a question for a regulator, and I think for a legislator, is how long do you wait for the market to solve something before you step in with a top-down solution that says, you know, we're not seeing this being delivered by the market. It's time for us to, you know, to jump in with where we can make things happen. You know, if every water heater in PJM and every EV in PJM and every air conditioner in PJM were under some kind of load control, the things we could do to load profiles would be mind-boggling in terms of demand response, both in specific sections of the distribution system and at the wholesale level. Because keep in mind that while normally the wholesale market and the distribution grid peak at the same time, they don't always. And so controlling load needs to happen at both levels, both the distribution level, particularly for like the winter peaking areas on the shore, and at the bulk power level, and being able to, and the frequency market allows some amount of play from the distribution system upwards and some revenue stream. But really the place where the valuation has to happen is going to have to be at the distribution system rate making level. And we haven't even started to kind of crack that nut yet. But I think there's a ton of potential, and the technology is just about there where we can do it without it being burdensome for the customer.
Well, you raise a good point. The service territory of the footprint of PJM reaches from Ocean City out to the Midwest in Illinois, and down as far south as North Carolina. Ken, does this sort of, is this a fantasy scenario, or do you foresee a day, perhaps in the not too distant future, where PJM would have large resources and load control via its utilities?
Yeah, I really think the time is now. I can foresee a day when all that can happen and all that can be integrated. You know, Molly mentioned the word technology. The other thing I would add to that, just ever so slightly, is certainly data and the analytics to support that, right? Having that information flowing into our control rooms so that we know, you know, when we get to certain points, certain triggers are going to happen, which are going to cause a certain customer behavior. That's going to be very, very important for us in order to operate a reliable grid and to operate it efficiently. Because today we bring on the least cost units. Maybe we get to a point where there's a certain threshold in the price of energy where some of those type of load responses are then activated, which would then drop the load slightly and not require us to bring on the more expensive unit. So I think there's a lot of integration and a lot of the blurring of the lines between the distribution systems, the transmission systems, and the jet generation, and how we dispatch all that as electricity continues to flow at the speed of light. Chairman Stanek, you're on mute.
There we go. Other thoughts? Owen, were you about to respond?
Yes, Chairman, I was going to just come off and say, you know, I have a passion for demand response. And in fact, that was when I first came to National Grid, it was to stand up our demand response division within our gas business. We, for a long time, have had peaking or interruptible tariffs, which are familiar to many in terms of working with our large commercial and industrial customers, including things like power plants who have historically not had a firm allocation on a design day and have provided a responsiveness to the grid. And that has had a huge impact in terms of how the natural gas system has been built out, right? There are, of course, questions and challenges to a fuel switching arrangement for large consumers, but it does have a significant impact in terms of the infrastructure cost, because unlike the electric grid, which is used throughout the year, right? Whether it's for air conditioning or non-space conditioning uses over the course of the year, the natural gas grid is predominantly used. A massive amount of it is in the wintertime. And there are, of course, people who have water heating as well. Some have cooking, some have decorative uses like fireplaces or gas grills. But for the most part, the majority of the usage is from space heating, which means that the system is very idle and very overbuilt for a majority of the year and is designed for a very small number of hours over the course of the sort of 8760 analysis. And so anything that we can do to look at demand response and load flexibility within the gas system potentially allows for different infrastructure choices to be made. And given how much of the year the infrastructure is underutilized, that has a real benefit in terms of the cost to consumers of the system that's needed to be maintained and the choices that can be made as we plan for the future as well. So I'm very pleased to say that National Grid has done a lot in this space. Very happy to share information or lessons learned that we've developed from this. We now have programs that are looking at both sort of reducing the 24-hour gas consumption by our customers, as well as shifting load within a 24-hour gas stay period, right? So load shaping and load shedding. We're rolling out BYOT programs for our residential and small medium business customers to integrate the technology Molly was talking about with smart thermostats and trying to make that work. We're testing out various devices to gather more data at the customer level, as Ken was alluding to, because of course, the granular interval data that is available on the electric side is typically not available on the gas side. And there are various reasons for that we could go into if we had more time, but it's something that we think will enable more of these programs. And we're also looking at behavioral demand response, which is really just messaging our customers and saying the grid is likely to experience high loads over the coming days. That doesn't mean they have to take an action. They're not signed up to any program, but we're trying to be as transparent as possible with our consumers about what the system is facing and what we are trying to manage to ensure that they do have safe and reliable service. Not to say, woe is us, you should feel badly for us, but instead to say, we're all in this together. We need to have a grid that works for your needs. It is built on behalf of you. You are our customers and our bosses in the sense that you are the ratepayers. And we want to make sure that we're bringing you into this, much as I alluded to with the community choice aggregation comments earlier, to ensure that we're all developing a solution that works for all of us as well as possible.
That is a great statement, Owen, in terms of communication. We oftentimes don't receive enough communication between our utilities and the ultimate customers, particularly on days when the system is under enormous stress. And I think most people would heed that call, lean less on the system, and it will have an effect on rates, on reliability, on a whole slew of factors. But getting that information out in a manner that's understandable to ratepayers is very important. We've had a lot of great questions today from our audience members. We weren't able to answer all of them, although I suspect you may receive some responses from individual panelists after the fact. Molly did want to respond to one of the earlier questions, so I'll give her that opportunity before we do quick closing statements, and then we'll turn it back over to Kathy. Molly.
Thank you. So there was a question from Lee McNair about customer choice. And I think that really is the biggest last piece of this. If we get the technology in place, is these programs are almost going to be entirely opt-in. I don't see Maryland going with an opt-out approach the way California has on some of these. But customer communication is going to be huge. And I'm going to make a broad generalization here. Utilities don't have to sell anything. They have an essential product that everybody wants. And they have a monopoly. And so encouraging the utilities to do better at selling customers on these programs and encouraging them to join programs and marketing these programs is probably going to be another challenge. But customer communication and customer buy-in is going to be huge. But I take your point very well. We're not going to take control of people's thermostats away from them. We're going to ask them to give us some level of control within certain parameters that hopefully they can customize to get these programs up and running.
Thank you, Molly. With with just a few moments remaining, perhaps we could sum up your thoughts, your aspirations over the next year, 5 years, in terms of how we see the grid rolling out. If the panelists could keep their responses to about 30 seconds, that would be great. Delegate Charcution.
Thank you, Chairman Stanek. You know I can't keep it to 30 seconds, but here we go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to the Clean Energy Center for coordinating this and creating this opportunity. And I just want to say, I think the question has got to be, how do we do it, not can we do it? I think too often we're asking, can we do it? We need to do decarbonization. We need to do it as quickly as possible, and we need to do it with equity and labor standards front and center. And so the question is how? And then let's be as creative as possible and get to work.
Creativity is the theme. Can we do it, Ken?
Yes, we certainly can. Hey, there's a number of things going on within our footprint where we're looking at the grid of the future. We have renewable integration studies, we have offshore wind studies, we have a number of stakeholder initiatives going on. And one of the things I've been stressing is it's going to take a village to really pull this all together to do this smoothly in a transition that we're talking about. This is significant. This is a significant change to the power grid. And it's something that we're going to have to do while we're keeping the lights on 365 days a year. And we're going to have to do it smartly. We're going to have to learn from other parts of the globe, like Europe, like Australia. And we're going to have to pull on the folks from academia. We're going to have to pull on our national labs. We're going to have to pull on all 5 sectors of our stakeholder community to do this in a logical, incremental, and intelligent way that really allows us to fulfill the state and federal policies that are required of us in order to ensure that we have a resilient and reliable grid of the future.
Thank you, Ken. We'll turn to Owen.
You know, I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be critical. This is really the decade where we demonstrate our commitment. And I think as part of that commitment, we need to ensure that we have creativity and collaboration with our communities, with our customers, and with all of our stakeholders. And I think the technology exists for us to do this. I think the cost is something that can be managed through financial innovation. We have to be thoughtful about it, but I think it can be done. And I'm certainly hopeful that conversations like this will be helpful in getting us there.
Thank you. And as we saw today, 94% of our polling participants are willing to pay a little more to make that happen. And Molly, you get the last word.
So I think we all have a very good idea of what we need to do in the next 10 years. And I think the 10 years after that are where it's going to be really, really interesting. And so for me, when I think 15 years ahead of time, you know, I imagine an EV plugged into my house. I imagine solar panels. I imagine a thermostat that knows what time I leave for work and what time I get home, and preheats and pre-cools, and a TOU rate that doesn't give me nightmares. And just being able to participate in all these programs that we have thought through and delivered in this decade, so that in 15 years when we need them, they're all there and available. I don't know if we'll have storage. I don't know if my house will be able to island. I imagine my dad's truck next door will island and I can go visit him if I need to. But I think just from across the board, from the vehicle market to the utilities to the bulk market, everybody's working towards making all these pieces fit together. And I think we'll probably get there in the 15-year time frame.
Thanks for those predictions. That was a great panel. Thank you for the discussion. Turn it back to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the panelists. Wow, just really substantive. I want to just bring the point up to everybody who's listening that I think our real challenge is to educate our consumer, because in the end, it's the consumer decision-making that affects so much of this, from the policy decisions that policymakers like Delegate Charcution are making, to the regulators and our willingness to adopt these modern and efficient technologies that Molly talked about. You know, we all could be the Jetsons home in 15 years, but we have to be willing to go there. So lots of substantive thought today. I can't thank you enough. We have some upcoming webinars that we want to share with our audience. Our next webinar will be on September 21st, where we'll be looking at climate-centric solutions, strategies, and policies. We have a great panel teed up for that. And then we'll be looking at the future of transportation and electrification of transportation, equity in the energy marketplace, a really important topic. And then how we build and bankroll energy projects, federal and state investments and incentives that are driving a lot of this, looking at the workforce readiness for the advanced energy economy, and then innovation ahead. What are those cutting edge technologies that are coming through the pipeline that are just going to disrupt what we know today? So we invite you all to join us for all of that. I look forward to hearing from you. I know we weren't able to get to every question, so much to talk about. Please join us for future events, and thank you again to the panel.